Welcome. I think we might as well start, especially since there are no more seats, and we want to thank you all for coming. We could certainly add seats as people come. Thanks, Richard. I'm very pleased tonight to host this lecture. This is a special event in many ways for me because I'm going to present you with not only a great American higher education leader, but something of a mentor of mine as a university president, and I'll tell you a story how that came to pass. After I was elected rector of CEU, but before I'd moved to Budapest and before I'd discovered all the wonders of CEU in Budapest, I had been teaching part-time at Tufts University, and many of the students in my class were very inspired by the local university president, the president of Tufts, who was urging students to become much more active in the community and in the world, was sending them out as part of various projects into various kinds of international organizations and local agencies, et cetera. So I figured I really ought to get to know this president a little better. I had actually met him when I was the head of the Kennedy Library in Boston, and of course you may know something about President Kennedy, who was very much on the track of public service, so we kind of hit it off. And the president of Tufts invited me and Ellen to join an international network which he had created called the Talwar Network of civic engagement for universities around the world, and we did that. We went to a conference that he hosted. So to fast forward, I'm now named the president-elect of CEU, and I'm looking for advice. I need somebody who's been a university president who could tell me something about how to run a university. So I went to see Professor Bacow, President Bacow, the president of Tufts, and I thought he would have a very long list of things that I should be doing, you know, ways to prepare, how to work with the faculty, and what various topics to understand, and how to do budgets and all the rest. But he had only, come on in, Simon. He only had one word of advice, which I take with me now almost everywhere that I'm working. What do you suppose that word was? The word was listen. He said, listen. All you really need to do to be a university president and to gather the information that you need to do that is to listen. And I think that was extremely good advice. So I came here, I spent a lot of time listening to a lot of people and learning much more than I think I would have if I'd otherwise come in. Come, we've got more seats, so come on in. Larry Bacow, whom you will hear from tonight, is and has been one of the most respected university presidents in America. He's, as I said, been a leader in many areas of higher education, certainly the issue of civic engagement, also a very strong proponent of access to higher education by, particularly in the United States, minorities and the poor, and the effort to develop need-based financial aid. He's also been very active in promoting interdisciplinary work at Tufts, getting the various parts of the university to work much more closely together. That was something that I was pleased to learn from him when I sought my advice after he told me to listen. He's also been very involved in issues of technology and how technology and the new information world that is out there is challenging higher education on so many fronts. So when he told me that he was going to be lecturing at the American Academy in Berlin a couple of months ago, I said Berlin isn't very far from Budapest, so you should come join us in Budapest. So I was very glad to find that Larry Bacow and his wife Adele were able to make the trip here. Let me say just a few more words about the topic of tonight's lecture, in addition to a few more words of introduction about Professor Bacow. There are many internal and external challenges facing universities today. We have some unique challenges here in Hungary and in Budapest and Central Europe, but there are challenges that are universal that affect higher education. And certainly the figuring out the role of technology is probably one of the greatest challenges that we face. And how to do that, how to link information technology to teaching and learning and research without either being overwhelmed by it or bankrupted by it, which I think is another challenge that universities face as they invest in technology. This is one of the biggest topics that we're facing, I think, as everybody knows, here at CEU. There are more seats, so, or maybe one or two anyway, come on in. You know that we are creating, and I've told Professor Bacow this, that we're creating a new position of Chief Information Officer, somebody who will actually help us think a lot of these topics through, someone who will be closely connected with our faculty and also engaged in one or more of the disciplines at the university. We have a number of faculty initiatives, which is, of course, the way that almost anything new should be done at a university, is initiatives that come up through faculty guidance. I see Young Mi Kim here tonight, who's helped us, along with Matteo Fumagalli, who's also here, to develop a really exciting initiative with the Korea Foundation in distance, online, digital learning that is connecting us with faculty and students at the other side of the world and allowing us to be a hub and node of higher education activities in Central Europe for students there and vice versa. It's a very exciting project. But we have plenty of questions to ask and to try to figure out how they should be answered. And I think since the advice that he gave me back 4 years ago when I came to see him about how to be a university president was listen, I will now give all of us advice. I can't imagine anyone more interesting to listen and more qualified to listen on this topic of the impact of technology on research universities than Professor Bacow. Just a couple of more words of background of his really quite extraordinary career. He served when he was quite young as not that you aren't young still, of course, as chancellor and head of the faculty of MIT. He's a distinguished expert in the field of in the environment, and particularly in alternative dispute resolution mechanisms for solving major environmental disputes. He is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and most important, I think, for the topic of tonight's lecture, he is the co-author of a really major study in the United States in 2012 entitled Barriers to the Adoption of Online Learning in U.S. Higher Education. So I think it's very wonderful that you're here with us tonight, Larry, and moderating tonight's event is our own Liviu Mate, who all of you know as Senior Vice President and Chief Operating Officer, but also founder of the Higher Education Research Group and professor in public policy. So please join me in welcoming Larry Bacow to CEU. Great.
Well, thank you very much, John, for that very generous and warm introduction. We should all be so lucky for the faculty in the room to have students as good as John Shattuck. As I understand, he's done a very good job of listening, but he didn't need to learn that from me. He understood that well in advance. In the interest of full disclosure, I should tell you all that you've been lured here under false pretenses, because if you look at this slide, it is not the title that was advertised. I had originally intended to talk about globalization and technology and the future of the research university, but after dinner last night and after we really had a chance to talk, I took that talk and I threw it away. And this is what we have for this evening, because John really asked me to focus much more on the issue, as he's described, of technology and how it is that we are all likely to evolve in the future as research institutions, given some of the interesting challenges and opportunities that are posed by digital technology. So what I'd like to do is to make a bit of an argument with you as I lay this all out, and stir the pot intellectually, and end with what I hope will be an interesting question for CEU that I hope we can all collectively discuss. So it's not as if I'm here to tell you, here's the path to the future. I think anybody who professes to know and understand that, given all of the uncertain evolution and the rapid evolution of technology in higher education, is misrepresenting what they know. Interestingly, the paper that John referred to that I wrote at the beginning of last year does not even really mention MOOCs because they had not yet been invented at the time. So it just gives you a sense of how things have evolved. So what's the biggest challenge facing higher education? And again, my talk has a U.S. perspective to it because that's where I come from, that's what I know best. But I would suggest to you that some of the challenges that we face in the United States, in fact, exist throughout the world. And there's really an easy answer in my point of view on this one, and that is bending the cost curve in higher education. If you look at issues of tuition, and higher education is breathtakingly expensive in the United States and getting more expensive all the time. The only thing that's gone up faster than healthcare costs in the United States over the last 25 years is tuition for higher education. All right, incredibly expensive. And in fact, if you take a look and try and deconstruct the numbers, you'll see that they've gone up steadily at about a point and a half % over the consumer price index in the US. But in fact, they've really escalated quite dramatically in the last 10 years. In 2001, just to put this in context, average tuition at public research universities in the United States, so these are the great public institutions like the University of California, the University of Michigan, the University of Virginia, the University of North Carolina, the University of Wisconsin, many others. Average tuition at public research universities in 2001 was 23% of median household income, and by 2010, it was up to 38%. Now, these numbers are distorted by a couple of things, so just so that you all understand. We have the Great Recession, which occurs in 2008, which does a couple of things. First of all, it flattens income, so there's very little in the way of income growth after that. And it also, at the same time, public support for these great research universities is cut back by the states that support them, and they have to increase tuition to balance their budgets. So the combination of that results in this big disparity. But by the way, it's not just in the United States that tuition has gone up, it's gone up elsewhere. So why do costs keep going up in higher education? And I will talk about technology, but it's really important, I think, to understand this point first. First, and this is true in any economy, and my co-author, Bill Bowen, together with his colleague, Bill Baumol from Princeton University in the mid-1960s, wrote a very influential paper in which they tried to explain why it was that costs they were particularly concerned about orchestras and art museums kept escalating more rapidly than the rate of inflation. And what they concluded was that in these industries, or these sectors, these particular fields, productivity does not grow as rapidly as it does in the economy writ large. And in any sector in which productivity does not grow as rapidly as the economy as a whole, costs will rise faster than the rate of inflation. Okay? It's pretty easy to illustrate this principle if you just think about the following. And by the way, this is true not just in the United States, it's true everywhere. We have one labor market. We compete for labor across all industries at one level or another. If all labor prices are inflating at about the same level, but productivity lags in one sector, then what that increment of labor buys in the future is less in terms of goods and services than it does for the economy as a whole. So if that doesn't make sense to you, imagine the following thought experiment. Imagine that it is in the early 19th century, and you are having a wedding, and you decide to have music at the wedding, and so you hire a string quartet to play a Mozart string quartet. All right? And for purposes of illustration, just assume that the cost of hiring that string quartet to play at your child's wedding exactly equals whatever 100 bushels of wheat would cost in whatever currency you're thinking about in the early 1800s. Now flash forward, and it's 2013, and you wish to have a Mozart string quartet perform at your child's wedding. Will it cost 100 bushels of wheat? 50 bushels of wheat? Or 1,000 bushels of wheat? And if you think about it for a while, it's going to cost a lot more than 100 bushels of wheat. Why? Because it still takes two violinists, a violist and a cellist, to play the same Mozart string quartet. But if you think about what's happened to the production of food since a couple hundred years ago, it's gotten far more efficient. And a unit of labor produces a lot more food than it did in the early 1800s, because we've had mechanized farming, we've had improvement in the quality of seeds, fertilizers, irrigation. So food has gotten cheaper relative to string quartets during that period. And if you think about higher education is a lot more like producing a string quartet than it is producing food or anything else that benefits from improvements in productivity. The second reason that costs keep going up is higher education is a strange industry, because we tend not to reward the least cost provider. If anything, it works in exactly the opposite direction. I always say, we know how to make higher education cheaper. It's actually quite easy. It's called bigger classes, right? Less student-faculty contact, less hands-on learning, less in the way of curricular options, simpler facilities, less support for co-curricular life. We can make it much cheaper. In 10 years as president of Tufts University, and 3 years as the senior academic officer of MIT before that, not once did I have a student or their families come into my office, bang my table and say, please do any of those things, by the way, and lower the price. If anything, what competition does in higher education is it forces costs up. It generally does not force them down, okay? So costs keep rising in higher education, and this is not a uniquely American phenomenon, although the numbers that I quoted before were. By the way, if people have questions as I go along, please stop me. I'm happy to talk as we go forward. So why should we care about rising costs? Well, I think that the big reason is that rising costs threaten ultimately public support for higher education. There are very few educational institutions that exist anywhere on the planet that do not rely at some level for public support. And public support can take many forms. It can be direct public support for state-funded institutions, but it can also be tax policy that favors philanthropic support. It can be indirect support in terms of research support. But rising costs threaten public support for all of higher education. And, Einstein said that the greatest miracle in life was, anybody know this quotation from Einstein? It's a great one. Compound interest. All right? So if you compound higher education costs at 1 to 1.5% or more greater than inflation over very, very long periods of time, eventually it gets very, very expensive, even more so than it does now. And what we know is that that situation cannot go on forever. And as I like to say about things which cannot go on forever, eventually they come to an end. And often they come to an end that is not particularly attractive or pretty for various organizations. So these are not the only challenges facing research universities. There are others. In the United States, at least, every major source of revenue that supports these great institutions is under pressure. This includes tuition. We're already seeing that right now. The ability of universities to be able to raise prices in order to balance their books is quite limited at the moment. Second, I've already discussed how state appropriations are declining right now. Direct public support is declining. Research support, at a time in which the federal government right now is officially closed in the U.S., but before that even happened, under the rules of sequestration, NIH support, National Institutes of Health, National Science Foundation, the competitive research grant support in the U.S. has been declining, not just in real terms, in absolute terms, by over $13 billion this past year. Gifts for current use have been under pressure, philanthropic support, because of stagnation in the economy. Income from endowments has been declining, or certainly not increasing at the assumed rate. In fact, almost every major institution makes assumptions about the growth rate in their endowment, and that has now declined in almost every case, whereas institutions routinely assumed a 9% return on their endowments over long periods of time, which allowed them to distribute 4.5% to 5%. Now those expectations have been cut back typically to 8%. And doesn't sound like a lot, but again, remember what Einstein says, compound that over very long periods of time, it has dramatic effects. And then corporate and foundation support has also declined across the board. Other challenges that we face: increased competition, in some cases from for-profit institutions, which have proliferated certainly in the U.S., but in other parts of the world as well, which seek to capture some of the demand for higher education, but also international competition. Show of hands. Any U.S. students here in the room? I know. What percentage of your students at CEU are from the United States, John? 11%. My guess is that if one went back in time, 25 years ago, slightly before the founding of CEU, you would have been surprised to find a major European institution which had 11% of its students coming from the United States. It's a global marketplace today for students, and actually a global marketplace for faculty as well. Just interesting. I don't have to tell you, you have 100 and some countries represented in your, pardon? Over 100. And I learned last night, 26 students in your new public policy program and 21 different countries represented. So you're a data point for international competition. By the way, 40% of the faculty from MIT were born outside the United States. So 30% for Harvard, again. So global marketplace. There's also, I think, as the price of higher education has risen, much, much greater pressure to justify the value of a liberal education is distinct from a professional education. People are taking a far more instrumentalist approach to higher education and looking at it, in terms of what will it buy me in terms of the increase in the present value of my future earning stream. I actually think that's the wrong way to think about higher education. I think it's a narrow way to think about higher education. But as the price has gone up, this is how more and more people are viewing it today. And then, another major challenge is just the rise of these disruptive technologies known as MOOCs, massively open online courses Concept originated at Stanford, quickly spread to MIT, Harvard, and now a number of other institutions. You've probably sampled on the web to see the nature of the courses that are being offered. In many cases, being offered literally to 50, 100,000 students simultaneously. As a result of this, lots of people are predicting the end of higher education as we know it. And I took the liberty of clipping 4 quotations from the higher education press. These are exact quotes from headlines that have appeared recently in the higher education press. Traditional residential liberal arts colleges are dinosaurs. And again, we've got lots of these in the US. Small liberal arts colleges who do not specialize in professional education, but rather in a liberal education. And most of these are private institutions that charge a fair amount for the privilege of attending. 25 years from now, only 50 elite institutions will exist. And this was referring to the United States. But to put it in context, there are 4,000 colleges and universities that grant degrees in the United States. So the prediction was, we'll only have a need for a small handful of these. Everybody else will get their education online at much lower cost. Higher education will be disintermediated. Right now, students go to one institution, they go there to get their, the institution provides the curriculum, the content, it provides the instruction, it evaluates the students, it certifies that they've completed, and it hands them a degree. And over time, that will become unbundled or disintermediated, with different groups swooping in, just as they've done for print journalism, for example, and peeling off the more profitable aspects, and other things will become a commodity and will be priced as a commodity, and higher education will go the way of print media. I'm looking at Ellen when I say this because she knows what's happened to print media. In fact, it's not good. I was reading an interesting article, an aside, on the plane on the way over in the New Yorker. And it was a description of a new online journalistic enterprise which is aimed at young women ages 18 to 34, and it's called bustle.com. And if you read the description, I mean, even the proponents of it describe it as reasonably vacuous. And the person who created it who, when he was 24, sold his previous creation, which basically did the same thing for sports reporting, Bleacher.com, for over $200 million. And in response to skeptics about this venture, he pointed out that the company that he created when he was 24 was today worth more than the Washington Post sold for just a few months ago. I mean, that puts this all in context. And one of my favorites, the basic business model for higher education is broken. Okay, the way in which we've traditionally operated is going away, and these institutions are going to go with it. Now, I must confess that I'm skeptical about all of these pronouncements. I think the death of higher education has been grossly over-predicted. So here's the good news for those of you who are nervous. Okay, why do I say this? Well, first of all, at least in the United States, kids go off to school for 4 years. What parent wants their son or daughter sitting in their bedroom or their attic or their basement for 4 years staring at their computer? And by the way, the kids don't want to do this either. So, I mean, here parents and kids have mutuality of interest in saying that they go off someplace. Second, content has always been available at essentially zero marginal cost. As long as you're willing to go into a library and check out a book, right? But content is not the same as an education. They're two different things. There was a movie in the United States several years ago that was wildly popular. It was called Good Will Hunting. I don't know if people who saw the movie raise their hand. There's a wonderful scene in that movie in which Matt Damon, who plays a local kid from Cambridge who never even graduated from high school but is brilliant is challenging these Harvard students for the affections of this very fetching young woman played by, right, thank you, Adele, Minnie Driver. And at one point, he's sort of asking them questions which they can't answer in history, and Matt Damon answers them instantly and said, you know, you guys think you're so smart, how much did you pay for that Harvard education? You know where I got this from? For $1.65 in late fees from the Cambridge Public Library, you know, just by checking out books. So it's always been the case that we've been able to get content at low marginal cost or zero marginal cost if people, you know, read a book. But that's not the same as an education. I'll come back to that at the end of this talk. People who say that our business model is broken may be right, you know, and may need tinkering with, but the providers of MOOCs don't even have a business model yet. None, zero. The people that are off creating these things, whether or not it's edX, which is a collaboration between Harvard and MIT, or Coursera, or Udacity, or anybody else yet. Here they're hoping if they can drive enough people to their websites, eventually they'll figure out a way to make some money off of it. But right now, nobody has. There's some ideas about how to do it. You know, we license these MOOCs to institutions, or we charge people for a certificate of completion. None of them have yet created anything like a sustainable business model. And then, I don't think governments are going to let their public institutions fail, and if they have to, they will act to protect them. Remember, while anybody can offer a course on the web, not anybody can offer a degree. One needs to be accredited to do that. You have accreditation here at Central European University, and governments may raise the bar for a degree. But I think the most important reason that I'm skeptical is my last one, and that is, why are we all sitting together in this room? You know? Why is it that people actually come together? Why did I travel a long distance to accept John's invitation to speak with you? And to, you know, have a drink afterwards. At least that's what I thought that was being set up for out there. I'm counting on it if you aren't.
Depends.
Education is a social function, and work is a social function as well. And people want to engage with others, and that's not going to go away. So, having said that, I do think that for the first time since Plato, we have an opportunity to really tinker with the production function for higher education. And this is good news, because online education is maturing, and it's only going to get better. Think about it. We have had thousands of years to perfect the lecture. 1,000 years to perfect chalk and talk, as we sometimes say. In fact, about the only serious kind of activity that would be instantly recognizable today to somebody who was engaged in the same activity several hundred years ago would be higher education. I mean, if you could take a picture of somebody teaching a class in 1800, it wouldn't look all that different from this. Instead of a computer and a screen, there would be a blackboard maybe, or something which someone was capable of writing, or even if not there would be a lectern, and somebody like me would be standing speaking to a bunch of passive people like you sitting in an audience like this. It would be recognizable, okay? It has not changed much. Online education is only going to get better. To say that it's in its infancy does it too much justice, all right? And another major study that we did at Ithaca looked at the effectiveness of online education relative to traditional education. We took an online version of a statistics course which had been created at Carnegie Mellon University, that, not a MOOC, but it was a highly integrated course which was largely machine taught using what we know from cognitive science to try and guide students through it. So if you get a wrong answer, it's sort of based upon the nature of your wrong answer, sends you back to material that it realizes you didn't quite understand. We randomly assign students either to the online version or the traditional version of this course, random assignment. And then we measured learning outcomes. And what we concluded was there were no differences. Not that the online was better, but it certainly wasn't worse. And what was particularly interesting was that this held for virtually all subcategories of students. So students who had been well prepared coming in terms of mathematical preparation did equally well in the online versus the traditional course. Students who had poor mathematical preparation did equally well in the online and the traditional course. Now, not as well as the well-prepared students in either one, but, okay, again, remember, randomly assigned. It was true for low socioeconomic status students, high socioeconomic status students. So again, it's in its infancy. It's only going to get better. And MOOCs are really giving us the opportunity to drive educational costs down, and I think permitting education to be democratized and made available to a whole group of students in different parts of the world, as long as they've got an internet access, students who would not have had access to high-quality content before, all right? And I think that's an unambiguously good thing. It poses some challenges for traditional research universities like this one. And what are they? Well, I think there's going to be increased pressure to demonstrate the value added of residential education. Let me be clear what I mean by residential education. I don't mean residential education where students live on a college campus. No, I'm defining residential education as an education in which students are physically in residence with their faculty. They're in the same room. That's how it's being done, as opposed to education which is being provided at a distance, okay? So I think we're going to have to think hard about what that means. I think as more and more of this becomes available, it facilitates more, not less, international competition, because the advantages of proximity disappear, or at least are not valued as much as they were previously. We don't have to go that far back in time to remember when students went to school near where they lived, right? That was the model that existed throughout the world, right? You studied largely where you lived, or near where you lived. And now research institutions are going to find that there's much more competition for their students wherever they happen to be. Now, there's a good and a bad side to that. I'll talk about that in just a minute. There's going to be increasing price competition because some institutions are going to figure out how to package content and provide a first-rate education at much lower cost than the traditional institutions have done. And I think that institutions are going to find that there's tension between the need to adapt quickly to changes which are being forced upon them by a rapidly changing marketplace, and our traditional notions of collegial decision-making, which have governed colleges and universities since the time that they were created in Europe 1,000 years ago. In the United States, we refer to this as shared governance, but most great universities are not operated autocratically. They are operated through the collective wisdom and engagement of the faculty. And, faculty are busy people and are not used to making decisions, very, very rapidly. But in some cases, to not make a decision is to make one for the institution. And I think that these changes are going to force institutions to make decisions, in some cases, far more rapidly than they are comfortable making, and will test our collegial traditions. So now I think the influence of online education is going to have a particular consequence for graduate education in the US. So let me just take a detour and explain why. In most institutions, research and education are joint products. One of the reasons why we have research universities as opposed to research institutes is that we think that there's virtue in joining the educational process with the scholarly process. And the way this works in a great research university is that, fabulous students ask us questions which we can't answer. And often what we do is that we engage our students in helping us to answer these questions as part of the research enterprise. And those answers then turn around and feed the next iteration of the curriculum and of knowledge generally. So it's truly a joint enterprise. Now, in the United States, undergraduate education effectively subsidizes this process. How? Well, graduate students in the United States often have part of their education paid for by becoming teaching assistants, and we call those TAs, for teaching assistants, in which they receive part of the support for their graduate education by agreeing to assist more senior faculty by teaching sections of large introductory courses. And in some cases, as they become more sophisticated graduate students, they move on, they take on more responsibility for doing some of this undergraduate teaching themselves. And that tends to subsidize graduate education. And I think actually causes many universities to overscale the size of their graduate programs. I think as online education becomes more ubiquitous, as we get better at it, more and more of these large-scale introductory classes, think about introduction to statistics, introductory calculus, introductory psychology, that may be taught with 500, 600, 700 students in a large lecture hall, but with 40 or 50 smaller sections. The sections themselves will migrate online. When that happens, we will see a reduction in the size of certain doctoral programs, which I would tell you would actually be healthy. Because one reason why, at least in the United States, we have a disequilibrium in the market for PhDs in certain fields is that we've subsidized the production of PhDs and overproduced them. Right? And so if you actually reduce the number of doctoral students coming out of certain fields, markets would clear. That actually would not be all bad, although it has dramatic consequences for those institutions that will see their doctoral programs shrink. We can talk about more of this in a little bit. I'm almost done, and then I want to open it up. So what does this all mean for traditional brick-and-mortar institutions like CEU? And this is what I hope we can really talk about collectively. The good news. I think there's a chance for you to extend your education to students worldwide. You no longer will have to physically come to Budapest to get a CEU education, if you're willing or interested in going down this path. That's the good news. The bad news is that other people will do the same thing and will be sitting there competing for very much the same students that you're looking for. Second, I think there's an opportunity to enrich what you offer to your own students by importing content and faculty digitally. I mean, think about it. Think about language instruction, and I don't even know, forgive my ignorance, but Olivia, do you do language instruction at CEU, or just assume that everybody who comes to CEU speaks 12 languages, which I know many people do?
We do academic writing at graduate level.
Okay. When I was at Tufts, one of the big challenges that we faced, I became president of Tufts, and my timing was exquisite, on September 1st, 2001. Okay, 10 days later, the world changed. And one consequence of that change is that all of a sudden, we had a large number of students, not inconsequential number of students at Tufts, who were interested in studying languages like Pashtun, okay, which we did not offer. We offered lots of languages, but not that one, right? And many other institutions had the same problem. Well, one can either seek to hire faculty to teach these languages locally, or you can import online content to enrich your offerings digitally. And I think there are a variety of ways that institutions will be able to enhance what they're offering their current students. And moreover, there may be faculty who wish to have a relationship with CEU, but cannot, in fact, commit to being present here in Budapest for a full semester or even several weeks on a regular basis, that you will be able to import digitally. So I think that there's a chance to enhance what you do here locally through enhanced content and faculty. And there's a potential to lower costs. Potential. Nothing is guaranteed here. Finally, I think there's actually a chance to use online education to enhance teaching and learning locally. There's much discussion throughout the world of the concept of the flipped classroom. Instead of asking students to come and listen to a lecture like this, because look, you've now suffered through 30 minutes of just listening to me until we get to the point where we can have a conversation. In the future, what we'll say to our students is, go watch the lecture online before any of us come in the room, and we'll junk that time, as official class time, and instead we'll use it. So instead of having, a 20 or 30-minute conversation, we'll devote the entire time to the conversation. So that would ideally enrich the nature of interactions between student and faculty. I also think that we have an opportunity to make the lives of faculty easier and more interesting. Why? There's an old saying in the United States: we teach for free, they pay us to grade. Much of the advancement in online education made possible through MOOCs is using artificial intelligence technology to basically automate much of the tedium of grading. And I think if you said to faculty, guess what, we're going to eliminate half the time that you spend on grading, not all of it, but half the time that you spend on grading. All the faculty members in the room, would that be an attractive proposition if I offered that to you? Nod yes if you agreed. I don't know of any faculty member who would say, oh, please, I'd rather spend more time grading my students. No. What people like to do is spend time teaching, not necessarily grading. So, I think that there are chances to improve the experience for students, improve the experience for faculty. And by the way, all of this online education generates a huge amount of data, which gives us a micro-level opportunity to understand how students actually learn, which has really been a black box for most of us in the past. So now, to realize the potential for lowering costs won't be easy. Traditionally, what higher education institutions are good at doing is doing more with more. John referred to this study that we did on barriers to adoption of online learning systems. One of the most interesting things is that institutions that had adopted online learning in a significant way, either to generate new revenues by bringing in new students, or to lower costs, if you ask, what did they do with the surplus? Not one of the institutions that we studied used the surplus to reduce the price of an education to students. In fact, they all used the surplus typically to either cover deficits in other areas or to just gild the educational lily even more. Even better facilities, even more curricular options. So I think this is, it will require hard work on the part of leaders to make sure that gains from online education are used to lower expenses for students. And I think that we cannot afford to just let MOOCs add to our cost infrastructure. I was at MIT and chancellor of MIT when we instituted something known as open courseware. I don't know if people are familiar with that concept, but we became the first institution in the world to commit to putting our entire curriculum up on the web. It wasn't online education, but open access to all of our teaching materials worldwide. I would tell you that that was a courageous and a great decision that we made at the time. But in retrospect, what we failed to anticipate is that we never figured out how we were going to pay for it long term. We were supported in our initial efforts by a group of foundations who were extremely generous to us, extremely generous. The Mellon Foundation among them, Mellon and the the Hewlett Foundation, underwrote this to the tune of about $11 million. But once the foundation money was gone, we never figured out how to cover the $2 to $3 million a year in ongoing expenses. And one of the challenges for institutions going down this path is to not say, you know, everybody else is offering free education to the rest of the world. We're going to do the same thing without stopping to figure out how they are going to pay for it. If MOOCs become just another part of the cost problem, then we have failed. We have failed big time. So that won't be easy. So, and this is really my last slide. If you believe that online education is only going to get better over time, and I think that's pretty hard to argue, given how new it is. It's not going to get worse. It will get better. And if you believe that a high-quality degree with instruction from some of the very best teachers and scholars worldwide will at some point be available at very low cost, and we're not there. We're a long way from being there yet, because right now, again, MOOCs generally broadcast education to the individual student without awarding credit or degree, but there are movements in this direction, certainly in the United States and I think in other parts of the world. If you believe that's eventually where we will wind up, then here's the question which I have for you. What is the value added of bringing students and faculty together in a setting like this? What is it that a place like the Central European University, what is the unique contribution of a place like the Central European University? What is your value proposition? And I'd like to pose that as a question which I hope we can all discuss. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Bacow, for this very thought-provoking lecture. I would have many questions myself, but I would not abuse my position, so I'm not going to ask any or answer any for the matter, because you ended your talk with a question. I would like to say a few words. I was thinking while listening to you about the audience. And this I'm doing by way of introducing the discussion. So colleagues tonight are mainly from European countries. There are very few from the United States and very few from other parts of the world. But I would assume your points raised based on the American experience resonate very much here. So that's a very interesting question. Why do we think more or less about the same issues in higher education that you think about in the United States? Second, you mentioned the passive audience. I thought there is a kind of perverse effect of technology. Many colleagues send me emails saying, I'm not sure I want to come. Are you recording this lecture? Yes, we are recording, and it is recorded, so make sure you send me the link. So, you missed a lot of questions because, they are really the passive audience.
For those excuse me if I interrupt, for those of you who are watching online, if you would like to ask me a question, bacow@tufts.edu. Okay.
I'm sure you will get some emails, and I will end with this. So again, looking in the room, there are colleagues, graduate students, and faculty members, and members of the administrative staff from various departments, from various units, and it is very rare that their subject is higher education. They either teach or study higher education. So what brings them here? Everybody can speak for himself, herself, but I would like to respond in a way with something that is also an answer to one of your points. We are a brick-and-mortar university, but in fact we think of ourselves as being less of a traditional university, perhaps as being an experiment that CU has been explicitly conceived as from the very beginning as an experiment. So we have done things for the first time in this part of the world, or perhaps for the first time altogether in the world, and there's a certain interest, almost an anxiety. What happens to us? What are the developments in the larger world in higher education? What is the future? How should we position ourselves in the context of new developments? So I presume this is very much why people from so many disciplinary horizons are coming here today. And with this, I open the floor for questions, comments, not too many disagreements, please, tonight.
No, please. We learn from our differences, so I invite you to disagree with me. Please.
Thank you very much for this wonderful lecture, and I would like to go back to the beginning of your talk, suggesting the paradox of American education when it comes to costs, is that the higher the competition competition, the higher the costs, or would you like to elaborate on this?
Well, sure. So, first of all, there's a bit of a conspiracy, not publicly, but let me put it a different way, a mutuality of interest between faculty and students. So, producers of education and consumers of education, in actually raising costs. By that I mean, the mutuality of interest is that faculty, all other things being equal, would like to have smaller classes and closer interaction with their students. And students would like exactly the same thing. Faculty would like to have a richer mix of curricular options, and so would students. Faculty would like better facilities, better classrooms, better laboratories, better libraries, better teaching facilities, and so would students. So I could go on. There's pressure from both sides to do more. So then the question is, well, where is the pressure to actually recognize what the opportunity cost is of committing more resources to doing one thing or another, and perhaps resolving this desire in ways that sort of say to people, look, I know you may want more, but you need to understand that means that we have to charge more if you do that. At least in institutions that have, ironically, as many students as they want, institutions that are highly selective in admissions, they can pretty much charge what they want. For institutions that are not selective in admissions, they tend to attract students that they need to pay their bills by offering them more amenities, not less. So institutions tend not to compete on price, they compete on quality. And as a result of that, there's inexorable pressure on cost and price. And I'm differentiating here between cost and price. We can talk a little bit more about that distinction if you wish. When I was president of Tufts, I developed a technique. I shared this with you when we had lunch, John. But whenever people would come to me asking for more of this or more of that, I would always answer in terms of the financial aid award equivalents. So students would come and say, gee, we should have, it would be nice if we had, I think at the time we had 24 varsity sports at Tufts. We should have 25. We had 10 study abroad programs. There was always a proposal for an 11th. At the time, this is when Wi-Fi was not ubiquitous, we're going back 12 years ago, most of the campus there was Wi-Fi everywhere, but in the buildings certainly, but not on the lawns and in the athletic fields. Students wanted to be able to take their laptops, sit under a tree, and answer their email to their heart's content. When they would propose these things, I'd say, let me tell you how much this costs in financial aid award equivalents. Are you willing to deny admission to Tufts and the financial aid that comes with it to somebody who was proposing something that cost $100,000 on an annual basis? One financial aid award was about $25,000. I said, are you willing to deny admission to four needy students to come to Tufts so that you can sit under a tree doing your email? I was the only one who made that argument. Nobody else was willing to do it. And sometimes I was successful, sometimes I wasn't. My point is that competition among institutions and for students drives costs up. It doesn't drive them down. And administrators like me find myself saying to faculty and students all the time, I wish we could do that, but we can't afford it. And they would say, I don't believe it. There's got to be money somewhere in the budget. Cut somebody else's budget. That's just. how it works in the States. I don't know how it works here.
Well, we have the same experience, and I'll give you an example, how competition drives up the cost. So we want to hire a very good professor, world class, coming from anywhere in the world here to Budapest. So that professor would say, I expect the same salary as, in Boston. And I say, but the cost of living is twice as, less here in Budapest. So you buy for $2 here when you get only $1. And that professor says, no. How would it look if I say I accepted $50,000 in Budapest, although you tell me that represents the equivalent of $150,000 in the US. So if you want to compete for the best professors, faculty members in the world, you should offer similar salaries to those of the best universities in the world, which happen to be in the United States. So, that is a huge pressure, and some countries have now official policies like China in that regard, and, I have to negotiate in these terms once a week or, once a month, and it is not easy indeed. So. Yes, John.
Let's go to your last question, which you posed to the group, and let's I don't propose that you put the slide back up. There was a very early slide in which you said content does not equal education.
Right.
Even though you then told us the story about Matt Damon and the cost of his education was $1.68 or whatever.
Yeah,
well,
the cost. He was capable of reciting historical facts.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, it was quite a brilliant
Right.
performance. But let's look at what you mean by that. I'd actually like to throw this a little bit back to you,
Sure.
although I can give you at least a draft of an answer from the CEU standpoint, which builds on Lydia's point, and that is that as you look at an institution such as this, the actual physical presence of people who are coming from over 100 countries who've mostly not been exposed to people from those
Right.
various countries that are represented here, does create an educational environment that is certainly very difficult to replicate digitally. Right. Now, that's only the beginning of an answer, but what did you have in mind by the...
Sure,
What
please.
did you have in mind by the point that
Sure.
content does not equal education?
So I'm going to stand because I find that I can't maintain eye contact with people in the back of the room. And I prefer this to be a conversation. It's sort of hard to do otherwise. So, I'm a great believer in what's going on here. I think amazing things happen when you confine students and faculty under temperature and pressure for some period of time. And I think when I said content does not equal education, the half-life of content which we teach our students is amazingly short, right? Given how rapidly fields are changing and evolving. We also know from cognitive science that even the best students remember very little, for very long periods of time. In fact, my former provost at Tufts was a cognitive neuroscientist who used to teach a course in his prior life. He was a faculty member at Dartmouth. He taught a wildly popular course on memory and learning at Dartmouth. And he said he encountered a student about 10 years after the student graduated who came up to him and said, Professor Peruccia, I just want you to know that the course that I took for you on memory was absolutely the best course I took during my 4 years at Dartmouth. And Jamshed said, thank you very much. I really appreciate the comment. What do you remember from the course? And the students stood there. So, again, I think what an education is, what all of us try to do, we try to teach our students to ask really good questions, right? Answers are easy to come from if you know what the right question is to ask, okay? I think that's very hard to teach, at least right now, online. We teach our students how to solve really hard problems, right? The hardest course I ever took when I was in college, I was an undergraduate at MIT, was a math course taught by a pretty famous mathematician who said, I'm going to teach you two things in this course. I'm going to teach you a lot of number theory, and I'm going to teach you the meaning of the German word Sitzfleisch, which you all know, which he translated for us as the process of sitting for endless hours doing gruesome work. Because he said no problem worth solving had ever yielded to anything less. And I don't think, carving up content into 12-minute videos and asking students a series of multiple choice questions at the end of it is going to teach students how to solve really hard problems. I think great faculty inspire their students. For the faculty in the room, most of us probably became faculty members because at some time or another, we had a professor who challenged us and who inspired us, and we decided we wanted to grow up to be like them. And this is what I think great faculty members do, and not just for faculty, but in all, faculty trying to train other faculty, but in all fields. Faculty inspire their students. They mentor their students. They stay with them. We talked about this last night, and continue to be an influence in their students' lives for years to come. There are lots of things that happen. We talk about the benefits of diversity because we do learn from our differences. Some of the most important lessons that I think students learn at a great institution, they learn outside the classroom. They learn from each other. They don't learn from us. Now, one of the interesting questions is, as we do a better job of developing online communities, will we succeed in creating these kinds of communities online? We talked a little bit last night about an online program which we created at Tufts, which actually has done this, much to my surprise. So, but I think that there are some very special things that happen, and that's just the beginning of a list. What's interesting to me about that list is that you will not find it described as the formal curriculum of any college or university. It, in fact, is the hidden curriculum. And I believe that institutions like this, and I include, Tufts and Harvard and MIT and every other institution in the world, great universities, are going to have to become far more explicit about what it is that represents the unique contribution of this institution beyond the content. And they're going to have to do a much better job of documenting that students who graduate from the institution actually get that. Okay? I'm not sure I know how to do that yet, but I think it will be important. Ellen?
I want to go back to your very first point, which is that neither parents nor students want to be the people in the basement watching a computer.
Mm-hmm.
I found that when I was teaching the political science department here, my students definitely learned more from each other
It's always
than
true.
I brought.
Yep.
Okay, so there was an interactive thing, which you could probably do virtually, especially in the future when you have even better virtual communities to interact with. But I was struck also with the notion that that they wanted to leave their home culture. They wanted to go to another culture
Right.
to be in.
Right.
And we can do that with virtual games, maybe, but that's only for certain hours of the day. You kind of have to live somewhere else. And when you ask about CEU, I'm answering that. It's very different from teaching at Harvard, teaching at
Right.
UMass Boston, teaching at Northwestern, all of which I did. This place is very different because people have come here from a different place to be here.
Right. So,
Not 40%.
so the social,
Close.
so the social scientist in me would tell you there's a selection bias there, right?
Yeah.
The people who come here are people who want to be in a different place.
Yes.
Right, QED. There was another slide that I had up there when I said higher education will be disintermediated. So imagine the following world, okay? Imagine a world in which the residential experience, the experience of sitting in Budapest amidst a community of learners, is separated from the experience of actually studying content. All right? So there's a campus here in Budapest, right, which students who want to be in Budapest come to. And some are getting their degrees from CEU, maybe. Some are getting them from Oxford. Some are getting them from, Cal State Fullerton, wherever. But the process of being in residence with a community of other people is separated from the process of getting an education. There are other ways that people want to be exposed to other cultures and have a burning desire to do that, can do it without going to a residential college or university. Adele and I had a sabbatical years ago in Israel. And there's an interesting phenomena in Israel. There's mandatory military service for all men and women at the age of 18. And when they complete it, they don't go right to college. These days, they all take a year and travel around the world, in part because they're looking for exactly the kind of experience that you've described. They want to be in another culture, especially having been in such a tiny, insular one growing up.
Just to add, I agree with what you're saying, but I think my students wanted to not only be in another culture, but they wanted to hear how other people from other cultures approach the same issues they were thinking
Right.
about with a guide. That's the teacher.
Right.
Or the TA. You don't have these huge discussion areas without some sort of moderation. So I don't think the TAs are out of business.
Well, I think that there'll be fewer demand for TAs in the 100-level courses that exist in big institutions where that's not what's going on. When people are studying statistics, they're not, anxious to have somebody from another culture who's doing the statistics. I think given what's taught here and what you've taught is of a different nature. And by the way, not everything is going to be taught online. Certain subjects lend themselves to this much more than others do. All right? I don't ever think we're going to teach philosophy. Dialectic online in the same way that we might teach statistics. So I'm just saying to you, Ellen, it's hard to predict the future, and this may evolve in ways so that people have different kinds of opportunities than they've had in the past, and that the students who may have elected to be here to learn from other students with a shared interest in studying the same material in a different culture may have more opportunities to do that than they have right now. That's all I'm really saying.
Any other comments or questions? Yes, please.
Question I have is, how do you even know if I'm right at a time? But you gotta make up your mind, is it?
Correct.
Whatever. One of the things that you mentioned was cloud computing. The other thing that's coming parallel to great speed is data mining.
Correct.
Which is MOOC and that sort of stuff. What would you do to start the students to be aware of that? MIT, for example, has 2,000 people who are alumni who are out there teaching STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, so people know how to do this. What could be done to make sure that these students get tuned in on the specifics and then start evolving? Because it's going to change dramatically in the next 2-3 years.
So, what we haven't talked about are some of the barriers to adoption of these technologies in traditional institutions, one of which is the faculty. In many cases, faculty are worried about their jobs. We could talk about that. But also faculty in some cases are just not conversant or comfortable with the technology. I think that's going to change very rapidly because the students of today will be the faculty of tomorrow. And students do everything online these days. I mean, it's sort of sad. You can see it when you go to some places, at least in the States, I don't know if this has happened in Europe yet, where you'll have students who are texting each other and they're in the same room. Everything is sort of moving online for them. I think the big data gives us some opportunities, but it also comes with a dark side. There's some privacy issues that are important, which we could talk about. The other thing which I worry about is that the data itself will be privatized by certain institutions, certain providers who are for-profit entities that will seek to keep the data to themselves because it's very valuable, knowing how some people learn and others don't, and how you learn specifically, as opposed to how you learn. If you think about, believe me, and it's the reason that Harvard and MIT got together to form edX and committed it all to be open source and to put the data in the public domain. Coursera and Udacity, the for-profit providers, have not made the same commitment. So we'll see. I'm not sure that's much of an answer to your question, but it'll be interesting to watch.
I think we have, I was about to say that the student will have the last question, if not the last word, but there will be one more after that. Yes.
Okay, thanks. So I think your topic is very important, especially because a couple of days ago we learned that the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to a 16-year-old activist who was fighting for the rights to have access to education.
Sakharov Prize.
Sakharov, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, almost.
Yeah.
Sakharov Prize, right.
Yeah, Malila, yeah.
Yeah, so, but in this sense, I'm wondering, so maybe you mostly take the case of the US, and that's why, but for me, it's more about people who anyway have more or less access to education. So, of course, in your article, you're writing about these non-traditional people, categories of people who have access to education, but then what about using this online system to trying to shrink the gap
Right.
between those who have the access to education
Right.
anyway and those who hardly can read and write. Of
Right.
course, and just that's my question. Shouldn't the international community concentrate more on the question how to provide more access
Right.
to education and not?
Thank you very much. It's a really good point, and I hope I didn't leave out the comment, which I thought I made, or at least I intended to make early on, that one of the great benefits of this is that it is providing education for people who would have no other opportunity at the moment. They're not getting a degree yet, but it is providing access to what's being taught at some of the world's greatest institutions at zero cost to people throughout the world, as long as they have internet access, which then becomes another issue, okay? One of my concerns, I'll just put it out there, is that the technological developments that we've been discussing may in fact lead to more inequality in some dimensions in the world. While it will make access to information packaged in interesting ways much easier to lots of people, and that's unambiguously good, I worry that the world is going to evolve so that there are two kinds of students. There are those who can afford to come to a place like this and have the opportunity that you're having to, rub shoulders with other students from around the world with great faculty who've been, who are doing scholarship in the field that they're teaching about. That's what a research university is. And then there will be everybody else who will get their information over a pipe, get their education over a pipe. I worry a little bit about that. But then, now I'm going to argue with myself. I have to remind myself what I always remind my students of, and that's the as compared to what question. If the alternative is nothing, then we're unambiguously making lots of people in the world who would have access to nothing better off. One of the most interesting results of the very first experiment that MIT did when it put its circuits and design course up on the web, 6002 for the MIT folk in the room, which is a course that is the first course that MIT first-year students take in electrical engineering. It's a course that assumes that you've had a full year of calculus, and that's all MIT teaches is 1 year of calculus, and a course in differential equations. So it's taught at a very, very high level. And one of the students who got a perfect score on the final exam was a 14-year-old from Kabul in Afghanistan. Okay? And so the ability to be able to identify talent worldwide and nurture them and encourage them is really quite remarkable with these technologies. I find that to be very, very exciting. So how we manage that going forward remains to be seen.
I think we have one last question.
Ingredients, say two things.
Okay. Two, yes.
I've really enjoyed this talk.
Thank you very much.
The first thing is a question about the statistics course. You said the results in the statistics course were comparable to the results in the real life course, in the online version. How did they solve the motivation problem with that? So you told us parents and students don't want to sit in their basement for 4 years. And fundamentally, you've got this motivation problem with online courses. People don't want to sit in front of a computer taking a course when they could be doing it in person. So that's my question about that. And then I want to come back to this, the suggestions on this final slide here. So if you believe, I'll accept the first premise that online education will only get better. The second one, that a high quality degree with instruction from the very, very best teachers will be available at very low cost. I'm not convinced by that. And I guess my worry is, how can you have a high quality degree at a very low cost? You might have a degree with Harvard or MIT written on it, but it isn't going to be a high quality degree, absent all those things that you just talked about that happen when you have students and faculty interact together. So the faculty giving the magic that happens when they meet, the stuff that comes from one-on-one interaction, the things that happen when that you can only do in small groups when you've got TAs in classrooms or faculty themselves, individually directing learning. And the third thing on the slide, what's the value added of bringing students and faculty together? in a setting like CU. It seems to me, one good way to address problems like this is sometimes to figure out the question you're asking in more detail, to flesh out what the problem is, to reach a solution. And if we just fill in the gaps in that question, we arrive at the answer to it.
So let me take the second point first. You may be right. Time will tell. What I can tell you is that there are a lot of really, really smart people right now who are working on this second problem. And I guess I wouldn't bet against them. And that there are institutions like Harvard and MIT that are thinking about how they partner with other places. And what would it mean? You might ask, Harvard will never give a degree that's offered online. Well, it actually already does through the Harvard Extension School right now. And my point is the quality of that degree is only going to get better. What we also know, if you take a look at how students are taking some of these massively open online courses, is that they are self-organizing and using social media to do this, so that groups of students are meeting in Bombay who are all taking the same course that's being offered, online through MIT or Harvard or Stanford or something else, saying, let's get together and talk about this stuff, okay? They're meeting in a coffee house. They're discussing things among themselves, right? So I think it's difficult right now for us to imagine how the world is likely to evolve and how it might in fact be disintermediated in this dimension, so that what emerges in terms of the quality only gets better. All right. Now we can argue about what's high quality and what's not. All right. But I think we can probably agree that whatever it is we're doing today, we're going to be doing it better in the future. As to your last point about the value added of bringing students together in a place like this, if my talk does nothing else, I hope it will stimulate all of you to think real hard about the answer to this question. Because we do not have the luxury, when I say we, all of us in higher education, regardless of what country we are plying our craft in, we do not have the luxury anymore, I think, of merely asserting what we all believe. That this high touch, high quality, but high cost education is in fact worthy of public investment and worthy, given the increment of over what one might do online, to justify the student investment as well. The last point I will make, which we haven't even discussed at all here, is there's another kind of student that online education enables. And that's a student who can't afford to be a full-time student in residence someplace. And what we know is that given the demands upon people, higher education is becoming much more necessary for people to advance in almost any society. And the people who didn't get it when they were 18 to 22 are still looking to get it now. And in fact, the fastest growing segment in the United States of the higher education market is what are called non-traditional students, which institutions like this serve poorly. Because if you've got 2 kids at home that you're taking care of, you don't have the luxury of taking several years out of your life to come back and go to school. There was one more question, but I can't remember what the first one was. So maybe we can talk over a drink. Thank you all. You've been a wonderful audience. I look forward to continuing the conversation.